Okay, welcome to this week's lecture on the history of English. I promised to record the lecture for those who went to events during the Climate Awareness Week. Unfortunately, technology let me down in the lecture hall, so I'm re-recording the lecture for those who weren't there. This video will be slightly more condensed than the actual lecture, but you're free to pause at any point. I also took the liberty to extend the slides a little, fix a couple of errors, so there should be enough for everybody, more or less. Okay, before we start, a reminder on suggestions for reading up on the contents of the lecture. If you want to, I would recommend The History of the English Language by Bohr and Cable. It first came out in 1951, is now in its sixth edition, 2012, and I actually work with an early edition here from 2002. So if you get your hands on a used copy, feel free to use an older version, which is quite fine. Last I checked, these paperback versions are about €5 in on a used books platform. So if you need something to put on your wish list for Christmas, that's definitely a recommendation. They're quite compact, but gives you all the relevant details for the history of English before you go into more specific topics. Today's lecture is based on chapters 2, 3, and 4, with chapter 2 a bit of background information that we'll return to in January, and chapters 3 and 4 will sort of form the basis for this lecture. Obviously, I left out some of the very specific details and give you more of a synthesis of the events that characterized Old English. Okay, so where are we now? We finished the internal history, which we looked at going backwards, so from more recent stages that are more accessible to the modern speaker of English into the more distant, mysterious periods of Middle and Old English. And now we look at the external history again, but going forwards this time, because external history is a bit more difficult to look into in a backwards fashion. However, to understand the internal history of a language, you cannot separate it from its external history, because the way the society is organized will have an impact on the way we communicate, and the way we communicate will determine how we shape language through communicative pressures and so on. Also, we've looked at primarily at grammatical and the morphology of English going backwards, and now, or what we left out largely was the lexical part. So we'll illustrate some of the external history using lexical borrowings as well, so that will tie in together. Okay, so now we move forwards again, tying the external history to what we know about its internal history, so we understand the internal changes a bit better. Okay. We finished off last week with establishing that although most English textbooks are based on one specific variety of Old English is far from a monolithic stage of the language, which applies to all stages for that matter. So we find clear differences between Old English and Middle English, but to our modern eyes and ears, they do look like foreign languages for which you require special training. However, their differences are relatively slight, right? So if we look at what we have looked at in the first block already, there may be clear differences between earlier and later periods, or earlier and later stages of a period, but there are also clear differences between different periods. However, that said, the differences within a period are sometimes downplayed, which is precisely what you find in many textbooks that base their analysis on a specific variety and a specific point in time. So while the differences within the period are sometimes downplayed, the differences between periods are sometimes slightly exaggerated because individual textbooks on individual periods would look at a very typical text rather than at the text at the fringes between the periods. So despite the clear differences and the fact that later stages look so foreign, that shouldn't make us think that that there is no continuity, right? So formed in the positive, there is an unbroken history of what we now call English, meaning the continuities between the period or the continuity over time is actually far greater than the discontinuities, sort of a bit of the break that you may think characterize English when you read certain textbooks. So when we talk about distinct periods, we talk about idealizations of that specific period, something that's very typical of that period. But again, keep in mind that we have a rather unbroken history over time, which becomes more mysterious the further back we go in history. We also briefly talked about the relationship last week of Old English to a sister language, or the language that it is directly related to, Old Low German, which we established are collectively more distant to Old High German. And you may have recognized this, is that English and Low German have sister languages that are more closely to English and Low German than they are to German, namely Dutch and Frisian. So they would belong to a subgroup of a language family we call Germanic. And to this language family also belong the Scandinavian languages. So we have West and North Germanic languages, and the North Germanic languages are themselves also quite similar between them, more distant to the West Germanic languages, but they share traits because they can be traced to a common ancestor. All the Germanic languages can be traced to a common ancestor called Indo-European, which is also the ancestor for the Romance languages and the Slavic languages. So these are three major branches of the Indo-European language family. Now, all these major branches themselves split into minor branches, right? So here we have the example of the Slavic languages, West, East, and South Slavic, which tend to be grouped by geographical proximity, right? So in general, so the more distant two language communities are, the more likely they will have distinct features and differ from each other, and vice versa. Such language relationships are often visualized in a tree structure. So we've been talking about branches and sister languages and parent languages, sometimes called root languages or the roots of a language. So the tree metaphor is actually quite obvious to visualize these relationships. They're not unproblematic. We talk about this in January in detail, but you can see that they some are more closely related to each other than others. With respect to English and its position in the Germanic language family, English has changed quite dramatically from a largely synthetic language, lots of inflections, to a largely analytic language where the grammatical relationships are expressed by other means. English is quite advanced on the road towards being an analytic language. So all the Germanic languages have lost inflections, but English is quite unique, not only with the loss of inflections, but also with the acquisition of or the development of different grammatical categories that you would not find in other Germanic languages, or not to the same extent. So so the change of English is typologically very interesting and quite unique to the Germanic language family. That said, it doesn't mean that German, for instance, hasn't changed. So if you were to read an old High German text, you would need special training as well. But they changed in a different way in the details. Okay, so much of that change in English has to do with its external history, to which we turn in the upcoming lectures now. Okay, so to appreciate the external history of Old English, in the very first session, I played you this very small clip which shows the four major events that happened during the time. So, of course, the situation is slightly more complex, but it gives us a great overview. So I'm going to play this clip to you again.
The History of English in 10 minutes. Chapter 1, Anglo-Saxon, or Whatever Happened to the Jutes. The English language begins with the phrase, "Up yours, Caesar," as the Romans leave Britain, and a lot of Germanic tribes start flooding in. Tribes such as the Angles and the Saxons, who together gave us the term Anglo-Saxon, and the Jutes, who didn't. The Romans left some very straight roads behind, but not much of their Latin language. The Anglo-Saxon vocab was much more useful, as it was mainly words for simple, everyday things like house, woman, loaf, and werewolf. 4 of our days of the week were named in honour of Anglo-Saxon gods. They didn't bother with Saturday, Sunday and Monday, as they'd all gone off for a long weekend. While they were away, Christian missionaries stole in, bringing with them leaflets about jumble sales and more Latin. Christianity was a hit with the locals and made them much happy to take on funky new words from Latin like martyr, bishop and font. Along came the Vikings, with their action man words like drag, ransack, thrust and die. They may have raped and pillaged, but they were also into give and take, 2 of around 2,000 words they gave English, as well as the phrase, "Watch out for that man with the enormous axe."
Okay, so we can talk about 4 decisive periods, cornerstone periods, in over the course of what we now call Old English. And we'll start with Roman Britain, which begins with Caesar's attempts to conquer the islands. He was unsuccessful. He managed to stay in the southern parts, but otherwise was met with fierce resistance from the local Celtic population. And it wasn't until about 100 years later where Claudius came with a much larger army, more systematic, who actually succeeded conquering the island. And so over the next few decades and centuries, the Romans made their way inland. They reached as far as what is now the border between England and Scotland. So they settled pretty much all of what is now modern day England. Some of the relics are still visible in England today, such as Hadrian's Wall, sort of the northern border of the Roman Empire in Britain. And with their settlements on the British Isles, they also brought cultural artifacts, such as Roman form of government. They built towns, fortifications. They connected the towns with roads, and also brought some form of modern civilization, right? So the Roman way of life, including things like water systems, heating, modern forms of trade, early forms of industrial production, and so on. And they also brought earlier versions of Christianity, so towards the end of their time in Britain. They more or less lived coexisted peacefully with the Celtic population, right? So they split roughly equally between the towns and the countryside. Language-wise, Latin most likely did not replace Celtic. Some of the well-to-do Celtic people would speak Latin, and probably some of the Roman population would also switch or be bilingual in both in both languages. So there was evidence of some bilingualism, even though they were actually living quite separate lives. That said, throughout the period, there were continuous attacks on this peaceful cohabitation. On the one hand, from Saxon tribes from the continent, but on the other hand, also from Celtic tribes that were not under the Roman rule, but they came from Scotland. Notably, the Picts and the Scot would continue to try to invade the Roman Empire. Now, with their Roman military and the legions, the Romans were always successful in restoring peace, sort of keep their empire on the British Isles relatively in a relatively stable fashion. However, by about 400, the Roman Empire started to break down on the continent, so it was difficult to justify the outpost legions in the British Isles. So by 410, the last legions actually retreated from Britain. This left a bit of an army void, right? So with the retreat of the Roman legions, the local Celtic population in what is now modern-day England had no defenses against the invading tribes from the north. So the Picts and the Scots resumed their attacks on the southern parts. So the local British population called for help, and they sought this help from Germanic tribes on the continent, notably the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. Now the Angles came to their defense, but they liked it so much, so they decided to stay and settle in what is now northern England and the Midlands, bringing in their families from the continent. The Saxons likewise settled in southern parts, and the Jutes would settle in the area, predominantly in the area today known as Kent. Right, so you see that many of these settlement patterns are still relatively visible today. Linguistically, we are not quite sure what the differences were between the dialects that came to England. The differences were probably very slight, so they could converse. They were speaking dialects of essentially the same language. And but what we also don't know is that for 200 years, 150 and 200 years, we have no written records of the Anglo-Saxons in England. By the time we do, there are clear differences between the individual dialects on the island, but there are also substantial differences to their source dialects on the continent, right? So, and these differences between the two, the continental and the insular Anglo-Saxon dialects, would be much greater than the differences between the Anglo-Saxon tribes on the island. So that goes back to what I said before, is that once you separate speech communities, they're more likely to diverge more dramatically than if they live in closer geographical proximity. We'll come back to the linguistic aspect in a second. Now, politically, the Anglo-Saxon tribes set up several kingdoms. So there was no unified English kingdom, but rather 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms known as the Heptarchy. So if you look up the Heptarchy online or in encyclopedias, you will find very different maps. So each map will look slightly different. Because the size of the kingdoms, their relative importance, and the influence on the cultural life in England at the time would probably vary between different times. But what is crucial to keep in mind is that they had no unified English kingdom. So they would be separate kingdoms with separate armies, so no unified English kingdom. There was, however, one kingdom's influence that stood out also over the course of time is the West Saxon dialect and West Saxon kingdom. So most of what we know about Old English is now is actually based on a dialect called West Saxon. And this graph illustrates this quite clearly. So we have the majority of Old English material stems from the southern part, the West Saxon part. So that is sort of the basis of Old English grammars. It also served as a quasi-standard of Old English. So by standard, we don't mean any standard in a modern sense, but in a standard in the sense that we have the literary tradition was pushed in the West Saxon dialect. And one man in particular that we'll re-meet later on, King Alfred of Wessex, also known as Alfred the Great, he was quite culturally aware. So he was a literate king. He recognized the importance of learning and of a literary tradition. He was also very aware of the importance of history writing. Okay, so he initiated some of the history writing that we have about Old English. So with that prestigious writing tradition in West Saxon, that's what we mean more or less by standard of Old English. We have the most textual material because of that cultural awareness. Therefore, that's the basis for much of the Old English grammar writing. Okay, so we come back to that and we'll meet King Alfred again in a second. Now, with Christianization, that was also came in two phases, but this part of Christianization began in earnest when Augustine landed in Kent. So what did they bring into England? Well, over the next 100 years after the first landing, they brought churches and monasteries, sort of the golden age of the Anglo-Saxon church. It also brought literacy and learning. So in the monasteries, the monks would be literate, they would study the Latin texts, and they would also start to translate many of these texts into Anglo-Saxon dialects. So that's the time when we have the first written records of Old English. Before that, there was no written tradition. We have very few records. Now, this early phase of Christianization ended with the Viking invasions, which predominantly came in 3, if not 4 phases. So the first phase were primarily raids on the coastal area. So small isolated tribes came from Scandinavia, primarily in a seasonal fashion to exploit for resources. But they also destroyed many of the monasteries that were situated on the coast. This was followed by a second phase where the Scandinavians came with larger armies, more systematically tried to conquer the island. They were successful in settling throughout the northeastern parts and conquered Canterbury, sort of the heart of the Christian England. They captured most of eastern England and put it under the Danish rule. They left out the southern parts up until then, sort of the West Saxon kingdom. But eventually they did try to conquer that as well, which is where we meet King Alfred of Wessex again. Alfred the Great would try and push back the Scandinavian invasion, and eventually established an armistice which would sort of keep the Scandinavian settlers from entering or sort of going further down south, and they established what they called the Danelaw, sort of an area where the Danish kingdom ruled with their own forms of government. After that comes the third phase, which we may refer to as settlement and assimilation, right? So after the armistice and the establishment of the Danelaw, we have a period of relative peace and assimilation, right? So the Scandinavians would bring in their kin to settle in England. So we have the establishment of many, many towns. We come back to that in a second. And we also have what may be referred to as the amalgamation of two peoples, right? So the amalgamation means that the relationship between the Scandinavians and the Anglo-Saxon wasn't merely hostile. So they would settle, try some form of peaceful coexistence, and this was relatively easy considering that they were not totally foreign to each other. They had similar linguistic backgrounds, had similar cultural backgrounds. The Danes that would come in from Scandinavia would assimilate to the local customs and also to Christianity. There was a relatively extensive tradition of intermarriage, right? So the two peoples would intermingle quite a bit. So as for the linguistic influence, we know relatively little. We'll come to that in a second. So we know relatively little for sure. So much of that would be informed guess or an inference, or indirect evidence rather than factual knowledge that we have. But the Norse and the Danes, or the Scandinavians more generally, would continue to be reinforced and influenced through migrations from Scandinavia and trade with that kingdom. Okay, all that together with the amalgamation, there is evidence that bilingualism was probably rather widespread throughout this area. Now, the fourth phase will eventually lead up to the Norman conquest, is that by the end of the 10th century, the Danes renewed their attacks on the continent up to the point where England actually surrendered to the King of Denmark. When the Kingdom of Denmark fell at home, that would sort of restore the King of England in the 11th century. So that's a bit of the prequel to the Norman conquest. We'll talk about that next week. Okay, now talking about the linguistic influences of that external history on Old English. As for the Roman Britain period, there's probably very, very little influence. The clip already said it. Once the Roman left, they took their Latin language with them. The local Celtic population, by and large, would not have been Latin speaking, and they were also pushed out later on by the Anglo-Saxon tribes. What we do have, and it's frequently mentioned, is the evidence in place names. So Latin probably gave the input for Chester or Chester, Manchester, Lancaster. Celtic languages were probably responsible for Kent and London. So Kent and London probably come from Celtic languages, but apart from that, there's very little. Also, the influence, especially of the Celtic languages on place names, can be put into perspective. So if we look at, excuse me, a map of place names in the UK that go back to, or that contain some Celtic element, we find a relatively scattered evidence of Celtic place name parts, right? So this map shows all these elements that could occur in any of the place names, prefix, suffix, part of the internal place name. By contrast, if we look at the most frequent suffix that can be traced back to Old Norse, we see two things. A, it's much more frequent, and B, it's locally restricted to the area of the Danelaw. There are a few other suffixes that we can find that go back to Old Norse, but B is the most frequent. You find it in Grimsby, Whitby, Derby, although I think the English say Derby. So compare the Old Norse map, or the map for B, with the map for all the Celtic suffixes, also word elements that are listed on the left. So there is, once you put it into perspective, it's actually a lot smaller than the impact that the Scandinavians must have left, which tells us that the Scandinavian settlement was quite substantial. So it was just in terms of sheer number. Also, in contrast, we look at the most frequent place name suffix that comes from Old English, ton, that you find in Brighton, Everton, Kensington, Paddington, and so on. So we see that there is more evidence from Old English and Old Norse than there is from the Celtic languages. Okay, and additional place name suffixes are listed here as well. I listed Chester here as an Old English place name, even though the evidence is that it is originally from Latin. Okay, so the influence of the Germanic invasions is, sort of the background for the Germanic invasions is that they brought mutually intelligible dialects, which may have differed between each other. But importantly, no written tradition up to that point, and we have very little to no record, except a few inscriptions. Christianization brought a new class of people, right, the so-called clergy. They brought learning and education. So that wasn't learning and education for the society as a whole, but restricted to the clergy, monks, priests, bishops, and so on in the monasteries. When they started to write in Old English, they adopted the Latin alphabet to Old English. So a couple of letters were added to represent the Old English sound system. And importantly, to help novice monks learn Latin, some of the bilingual monks would write literal word-for-word translation in English into the Latin text. So that's sort of the earliest records that we have of Old English. After that, we have a relatively quick succession of original Old English texts. With the Viking invasion, we have extensive settlements, right? So up to 1400 place names in England go back to the Viking Age. They brought new words, but likely they didn't bring new concepts. So while Christianization brought new concepts in a church-related and philosophical-related tradition, the words that we find in the Viking Age are not so different to the ones that were already on the island. But we also have an influence of bilingualism and the pressure of language contact, right? Not the direct transfer of things, but the pressure when two peoples come together in language contact situation. Okay, so the actual influence, if you want to put that into perspective, for Roman Britain, that was negligible, except for in the place names, even though that shouldn't be exaggerated. For the Germanic invasion, we have the most dramatic influence, obviously, because the core, sort of the foundation of Old English is truly Germanic in grammar and lexis. Christianization brought new concepts, so we have an impact on the lexis, and the Viking invasion, I put it down there that this impact was quite substantial, and I'll explain in a minute of what I mean by substantial influence. Right, so as I said, the foundation of Old English, and English for that matter, to this day, is firmly Germanic. The basics of grammar is clearly Germanic. So we talked about this a lot with the pronouns. So we can still see the pronouns in modern English, determiners as well, and conjunctions. So when we read one of this Old English text, we noticed the little bits and pieces that we recognized instantly. They would come from sort of the function words, and they survive to this day. So, and also survives to this day is the basic and the core vocabulary. What do we mean by that? Well, the basic vocabulary is still recognizable today. Man, wife, child, house, wall, meat, leaf, gourd, and so on and so forth. The function words would also be recognizable, right? So they also can also be traced back to Anglo-Saxon. But what has changed, in contrast to that, and what makes Old English so difficult to read sometimes, is that the non-basic vocabulary that has changed over time. There's several reasons why this happened, and part of that we'll revisit next week when we talk about Middle English. But so the non-basic vocabulary has either fallen out of use, was replaced over time, or changed so that it can't be recognized today. In contrast now with Christianization, they brought in lexis primarily in terms of learned vocabulary or learned vocabulary. What do we mean by that? Well, basically two phases here. So we have the early phase, which is church-related, but everyday items, right? So they were initially church-related, but they have made their way into our core vocabulary: anthem, ark, candle, mass, minster, priest, school, and so on. The second phase is more philosophical or intellectual. Antichrist, apostle, creed, demon, idol, prophet. So they would not be the core of everyday items, but they would be more in the intellectual tradition. So that brings us a bit to lexical borrowings. You are very likely to borrow lexical items if you have new concepts. So if you have a pagan society that is introduced to Christianity, obviously they're new objects that need naming: church, altar, learning, school, master. So new concepts, new words, you borrow them. And it's also an indication of the cultural significance of Christianization on Anglo-Saxon England. We also see at that time that Old English was quite vibrant. It was very vital. And we see that by the linguistic integration of these words, right? So if you borrow words, you don't simply borrow them, but you try to incorporate them into your local morphosyntax. What do we mean by that? Well, in word formation, for instance, we have the borrowing mater, but then they use Germanic suffixes to turn mater, something very concrete, a very concrete noun, into martyrdom, which is an abstract noun, right? So this it kind of shows the vitality of Old English because it was capable of integrating new material into its own system. We also find it in derivation, right? So we have mater, which could be then turned into a verb, and once it is turned into a verb, it gets the local or the native prefix ye and suffix ian, which is an infinitive suffix. Okay, so let's turn to what we call the relatively substantial influence of the Viking invasions. On the one hand, there was, again, like with Christianization, an influence on the level of the lexis. So there is, think about two, as if you were combining two households, right, into one. So obviously the Scandinavians would bring their basic vocabulary, simple everyday words. So different to the Christianization, they didn't bring new concepts or new objects, but they brought words for which the Anglo-Saxon population already had some words. So they would be very similar because both go back to the common ancestor of Germanic. So a couple of things can happen if you throw two lexicons together. Either a word, one word falls out of use, or one word is sort of redefined, sort of gets a new meaning. So one example for replacement probably we had over the course of history is neman and take. So the old Anglo-Saxon word for take was neman, and that was replaced entirely by the Scandinavian borrowing. In general, however, it's very difficult to say whether a word is from Old English or Old Norse because the languages were very similar and go back to a common ancestor. But there are sometimes indications of where we know where a word actually comes from, and the one of these aspects is phonological form. And the simplest example in this case is probably the case of the sh and sk words. So if we have a word that is today's pronounced with a sh, but written with an sc in Old English, we're very relatively certain that this word was an Anglo-Saxon word, as opposed to a word that begins in a sk, like sky, skin, and skirt. We can be relatively certain that this is Old Norse, an Old Norse borrowing. Why? Because there was a sound change in Old English, and that happened before the Viking invasion. So once we have a word that does not show this sound change, like sk, sky, skin, skirt, then that must have been borrowed after the sound change had happened in Anglo-Saxon dialects, because if the word had come beforehand, it would have been affected by the sound change. Okay, so that was the lexis. influence on the level of syntax actually quite substantial as well, because that's what we talked about last week, is that language contact situations possibly accelerate the loss of inflections. So recall that the languages used similar systems, so each of them had the same grammatical categories, but they used different endings. What was similar was the word stems. Now, in a contact situation, if you want to be understood, you use the stem. You focus more on the stem rather than the endings, and you discard of the ending. So that's one possible scenario that explains an accelerated loss of inflections. Part of the evidence for that comes from the fact that in the little text that we do have from northern parts of England, these texts show a significantly greater rate of inflectionless endings, and sort of they were further down in the road of losing inflections. So there is a bit of indirect evidence that this actually may have been the case. We also talked about the pronouns of English today. So the third person plural pronouns, they very likely go back to Scandinavian borrowings. So that shows some substantial influence, right? So we have a difference between lexical borrowings. You know, a word like sky, skin, and skirt is sort of for something very concrete, but and that's easily borrowed for in any contact situation. However, grammatical borrowings are a lot less frequent. So if they do occur, they point to a substantial contact between two language communities. So grammatical borrowings are being more difficult and subconscious. So you need more extended language contact over a more extended period of time. And the same can be said for to be. So all the R forms likely go back to Old Norse, but which essentially means that they are, or the bigram, you know, two words together, two tokens, they are is a very frequent expression, or very frequent occurrence, and that being entirely traceable back to Old Norse suggests that we have significant influence of Scandinavian languages on Old English. Okay, so we have multiple cornerstone events over the period of Old English, and they each left their quite distinct imprint on Old English, but that shouldn't make us think that there was a complete shift, right? So the actual understructure is still visibly Old English or Anglo-Saxon, but the different cultural events certainly left their mark. So if you wanted to make one distinction between especially the Christianization and the Viking invasions, you could say that the lexical borrowings from dating back to the Christianization bit showed the heavy influence that this had on the cultural life, the shaping of ideas, the organization of society, whereas the Viking invasions would sort of indicate the strong extent of that contact. Now, again, don't take this to mean that the Scandinavians completely reshifted the English language, but their presence was certainly a significant factor of the shaping of Old English. Okay, so as a wrap up to this session, we can go back to our language family tree and talk a bit about a question that arose in one of the earlier lectures, right? So last week when we talked about the dual in Old English, the question came up, is the dual actually a borrowing from the Celtic languages? Now, if you look at this language tree, the Celtic languages are sort of there, the small number of speakers, that's why it's so tiny. And the dual is a grammatical category that distinguishes between singular, just one, dual, two, and then a plural, three or more. Right, so we talked a bit about how Old English had traces of a dual. It was pretty much lost already by early Old English, or by the earliest records. And then someone asked, like, is that a borrowing from Celtic? Because the old Celtic languages also had a dual. So the question is, did that affect Old English, and sort of was that a borrowing from Celtic? Now that's possible. So we have two scenarios. Either it's a borrowing, or it's descended from some other language or stage of the language. And with what we heard today, what we talked about today, we can sort of make an informed guess of why the borrowing scenario is actually relatively unlikely. Okay, first, the dual is a grammatical category. And for this scenario to have a borrowing of a grammatical category would presuppose intense linguistic exchange and linguistic contact between two peoples. Now, we saw that this was likely not the case. So that's our first blow to the borrowing scenario. And if it was, it would be highly unusual. It would be highly unusual because we don't have much evidence even for lexical borrowing. So lexical borrowings being the stuff that's borrowed more easily. So we don't have that. Therefore, the borrowing of a grammatical category is even more unlikely. Now, the second scenario would be, does it go back to a common ancestor? And this is probably what happened. So if you looked into all the other languages, or in along that branch of the European languages, you would actually find that all the ancestor languages of the Romance languages, the Slavic languages, and most Germanic languages had a dual. Now that suspects or suggests that Indo-European, as the parent language of all these sub-branches, would have also had a dual. And in fact, if you look at the Iranian languages that we haven't talked about, but they also belong to the Indo-European family of languages, that's the Indo in there, they also had a dual. So here we have evidence that the parent language to all these languages very likely had a dual, which then got lost along the path of time in the individual branches, but that we still see traces of that in Old Celtic languages, and in fact we still see it in local dialects of Scots Gaelic. And the only living languages on the continent that would still have, or that still have a dual today, are Slovene, and which is a Southwest Slavic language, and Sorbian as a West Slavic language that is still spoken in some areas in Eastern Germany. So here we have an informed inference of the sort of the workings of language change and grammatical change. So here we would sort of dismiss the influence of Celtic on English in terms of the dual, because the scenario that it was inherited from some parent language and just simply got lost in other languages is much more likely. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. I hope you enjoyed this little condensed lecture. Next week we'll talk about Middle English and sort of pick up a lot of these ideas, especially in a language contact situation, and what is changed in the contact situation between English and French, and what isn't in terms of the continuity assumption that we saw characterizes English as a whole. Okay, thank you. Bye.